What if everything you see right now isn't actually there? Not in the way you think. The walls, your phone, even your own body. What if they only exist because they're being perceived? George Berkeley built a philosophy around this exact idea, that reality isn't made of matter at all. And once you follow his logic to the end, it becomes very hard to prove him wrong. George Berkeley was born in 1685 in Ireland, at a time when the world was beginning to shift in a way that would permanently change how reality itself was understood. Science was rising, mathematics was expanding, and thinkers like Newton and Locke were redefining the structure of the universe. The world was increasingly being described as something mechanical, something that exists independently of human perception, governed by fixed laws that operate whether anyone observes them or not. Reality, in this new vision, was solid, external, and objective. But from early on, there was something about this picture that did not sit right with him. He was educated at Trinity College in Dublin, where he quickly showed an unusual ability to engage deeply with philosophical problems. He studied the works of earlier thinkers, absorbing ideas about knowledge, perception, and existence. But unlike many who simply build upon what came before, he began to question something more fundamental. Not just what we know, but how we know it, and whether what we think of as reality actually exists in the way we assume. At the time, John Locke's philosophy had become highly influential. Locke argued that the mind begins as a blank slate and that all knowledge comes from experience. Objects in the world, according to this view, exist independently, and our senses provide us with information about them. We see a tree, we touch it, we experience it, and from these experiences, we form ideas about what it is. But Berkeley saw a problem hidden inside this framework. If everything we know about the world comes through perception, through sight, touch, sound, and so on, then we never actually experience the object itself. We only experience our perception of it. We do not encounter the tree directly. We encounter the color, the shape, the texture, the sensation. All of these exist within the mind. This realization led him to a question that would define his entire philosophy. If all we ever experience are perceptions, then what reason do we have to believe in a material world that exists beyond those perceptions? Most people would respond by saying that the material world must exist because it causes those perceptions. But he challenged this assumption. The idea of a material substance that exists independently of perception is not something we can observe. It is something we infer. And if all knowledge comes from experience, then this inference has no direct foundation. From this point, his thinking took a radical turn. He argued that the idea of matter as something that exists independently of the mind is unnecessary. It adds an extra layer that cannot be experienced and does not explain anything that cannot already be explained through perception itself. Instead of saying that objects exist outside the mind and are perceived by it, he proposed something far more extreme. Objects exist only as they are perceived. This idea is often summarized in a simple phrase, to be is to be perceived. At first, this sounds almost impossible to accept. It seems to suggest that the world disappears when no one is looking at it. But his argument is more subtle than that. He is not saying that things cease to exist entirely. He is saying that their existence is inseparable from perception. A thing is not something that exists behind its appearance. It is its appearance. A tree is not something hidden behind the color, shape, and texture we experience. It is those qualities. Remove perception, and there is nothing left to describe. This view directly challenges the growing scientific picture of the world as something made of solid matter, existing independently of observers. It suggests that what we call reality is not something separate from experience, but something that exists within it. But this raises an immediate problem. If objects only exist as they are perceived, what happens when no human is observing them? Does the world simply disappear? This is where his philosophy takes another important step. He introduces the idea that there is a constant perceiver, something that does not stop observing the world even when humans are not present. This perceiver is God. In his system, God is not just a distant creator. God is the continuous observer that sustains the existence of the world. Everything that exists continues to exist because it is perceived by this infinite mind. Human perception becomes part of a larger system, where individual experience is grounded in a constant, universal awareness. This allowed him to maintain the stability of the world without relying on the idea of independent material substance. The world does not disappear when no one is looking at it, because it is always being perceived at a higher level. By this stage, his philosophy had taken shape as one of the most radical forms of idealism ever proposed. It rejects the existence of matter as something independent and replaces it with a reality that exists entirely within perception and mind. What makes his position especially powerful is that it follows a strict line of reasoning. If all knowledge comes from experience, and experience consists only of perceptions, then introducing an unseen material world becomes unnecessary. His system removes that assumption entirely. At the same time, it leaves behind a view of reality that is deeply unsettling. It suggests that what we take to be solid and external may not exist in the way we think. That reality is not something we step into, but something that exists only as it is experienced. By the time he fully developed these ideas, he had already set himself apart from the dominant direction of thought in his time. While others were building a world of matter, laws, and mechanisms, he was dismantling the very foundation of that world, replacing it with something far less tangible, but internally consistent. And in doing so, he raised a question that still feels difficult to answer. If everything we know comes through perception, what justifies the belief in anything beyond it? As his ideas continued to develop, what made his philosophy increasingly powerful was not just how radical it sounded, but how carefully he tried to defend it against the obvious objections that came almost immediately. Because once someone hears the claim that reality exists only through perception, the first reaction is resistance. It feels like common sense is being attacked. The world appears solid, stable, and independent. It does not feel like something that depends on being perceived. He understood this reaction, and instead of dismissing it, he began to examine it more closely. Why does the world feel external and independent? What gives rise to that sense of solidity? And can that feeling itself be explained without assuming the existence of matter? He pointed out that the consistency of experience plays a crucial role. When you look at an object, turn away, and then look back again, it appears the same. This repetition creates the impression that the object exists continuously, even when not observed. But in his view, this does not prove the existence of matter. It only shows that our experiences follow stable patterns. These patterns, he argued, do not need to be explained by material substance. They can be understood as part of the structure of perception itself. The regularity of experience gives rise to the belief in an external world, but that belief goes beyond what is directly given. He also addressed the idea of causation, something that plays a central role in how people understand reality. In the common view, objects interact with one another in a physical way. A stone hits a window, and the window breaks. It seems obvious that one physical object causes a change in another. But he challenged this assumption by focusing on what is actually experienced. We do not observe causation itself. We observe a sequence, one event followed by another. The idea that one causes the other is something we add based on repeated observation. It is a pattern we recognize, not a force we directly perceive. From this perspective, causation becomes part of the order of experience rather than evidence of an underlying material mechanism. The world appears to operate according to consistent rules, but those rules do not require the existence of matter to function. This line of thinking allowed him to push his argument further. If the stability and order of the world can be explained through consistent patterns of perception, then the idea of matter becomes not only unnecessary, but potentially misleading. It suggests a hidden layer of reality that cannot be experienced and does not need to be assumed. At the same time, he was careful to distinguish his view from skepticism. He was not arguing that nothing exists or that reality is uncertain in a chaotic sense. On the contrary, he believed that reality is perfectly real. What he rejected was not the existence of a world, but the assumption that it exists independently of perception. In his view, the world is not an illusion. It is exactly what it appears to be, a collection of perceptions that are consistent, structured, and meaningful. The mistake, he argued, is to imagine that there is something behind those perceptions that constitutes the real object. This distinction is crucial. It allows his philosophy to avoid collapsing into complete doubt. The world remains stable, predictable, and reliable. The difference is that its existence is grounded in perception rather than in an unseen material substance. He also turned his attention to the nature of language and abstraction. He noticed that many philosophical problems arise from the way language is used. Words like matter, substance, and object create the impression that they refer to something concrete and independent. But when examined closely, these terms often refer to ideas that cannot be directly experienced. This led him to criticize what he saw as the misuse of abstraction. When people talk about matter as something that exists beyond perception, they're using language to create the illusion of something that cannot actually be observed. The word suggests a reality that is never directly encountered. By exposing this, he aimed to simplify philosophy, to remove unnecessary concepts and focus only on what can be directly known. This approach made his arguments feel both radical and strangely precise. He was not adding complexity, he was removing it. At the same time, his reliance on God as the constant perceiver became more central to his system. Without this idea, his philosophy risks collapsing into a form of solipsism, the view that only one's own mind exists. But he avoided this by emphasizing that perception is not limited to individual human minds. The world is shared, consistent, and continuous because it is grounded in a universal perception. Human experience becomes a partial participation in a larger system. This allows multiple individuals to experience the same world without requiring a material foundation. Yet this aspect of his philosophy also raises further questions. It shifts the explanation from matter to mind, but it introduces a different kind of assumption. Instead of an unseen material substance, there is an unseen universal perceiver. The structure changes, but the need for something beyond individual experience remains. He did not see this as a weakness, but as a necessary conclusion. If perception defines reality, then there must be something that ensures its continuity beyond individual minds. For him, this role could only be fulfilled by something infinite and constant. As his work continued, he became more confident in the internal consistency of his system. He had taken the empiricist starting point, that all knowledge comes from experience, and followed it to a conclusion that few were willing to accept. He removed matter entirely, replacing it with a world that exists only as it is perceived, yet remains stable through a higher form of perception. What makes this stage of his philosophy especially striking is how it forces a reconsideration of what seems most obvious. The idea that the world exists independently of us feels certain, almost unquestionable. But his arguments show that this certainty may be based more on habit than on direct evidence. And once that possibility is considered, even briefly, it becomes difficult to return to the original assumption with complete confidence. As his philosophy matured further, what became increasingly striking was not just the boldness of his conclusions, but the way he began to explore their deeper implications for how human beings understand reality itself. By this stage, his work was no longer simply about denying matter or redefining existence in abstract terms. It had begun to reshape the very relationship between the observer and the world, dissolving the boundary that most people assume exists between the two. In the ordinary view of life, there is always a separation. On one side, there is the individual, the observer, the one who perceives. On the other side, there is the world, external, independent, and existing on its own. This division feels natural, almost unavoidable. It is built into language, into thought, into everyday experience. But his philosophy quietly removes this division. If everything that exists is known only through perception, then the idea of a completely separate external world becomes difficult to maintain. The world is not something that stands apart from the observer. It exists only within the act of being perceived. This does not mean that the individual creates the world at will, but it does mean that the world and perception cannot be separated into two independent realities. This shift has a profound psychological effect. It changes how one relates to everything. Objects are no longer distant or detached. They are part of the same field of experience as the observer. The boundary between subject and object becomes less clear, almost fluid. At the same time, he continued to refine his understanding of the mind itself. He distinguished between different types of ideas, those that arise from imagination and those that come through sensory experience. Imagination, in his view, is less vivid, less stable, and more under individual control. Sensory experience, on the other hand, is stronger, more consistent, and follows patterns that the individual does not control. This distinction allowed him to maintain a difference between what is real and what is imagined, even within a system that denies material substance. The real world is not defined by its independence from perception, but by the consistency and structure of the perceptions themselves. What is real is what resists arbitrary change, what follows stable patterns, what appears with a kind of force that cannot simply be altered by will. This idea helps resolve one of the most common misunderstandings of his philosophy. It is often assumed that if reality exists only in perception, then anything can be changed at any moment, that the world becomes unstable or dreamlike. But his system does not allow for that. The order of perception is not random. It is governed by a structure that remains consistent over time. That structure, once again, points back to the idea of a universal perceiver. The stability of the world is not maintained by individual minds, but by something beyond them. This ensures that reality remains coherent, shared, and predictable. He also began to reflect more deeply on the role of science within his framework. At first glance, his philosophy seems to stand in direct opposition to scientific thinking, which relies heavily on the idea of a material world governed by physical laws. But he did not reject science entirely. Instead, he reinterpreted its meaning. Scientific laws, in his view, do not describe the behavior of matter. They describe the regularities of perception. When science identifies patterns, such as the motion of objects or the behavior of light, it is not uncovering the properties of an independent material world. It is identifying the consistent ways in which experiences occur. This reinterpretation allows science to remain valid, but changes its foundation. It becomes a study of patterns within perception rather than a description of an external reality that exists beyond it. This subtle shift preserves the usefulness of science while aligning it with his broader philosophical system. At the same time, he became increasingly aware of how deeply rooted the belief in matter is within human thinking. It is not just an intellectual position. It is reinforced by language, by habit, by the way people are taught to understand the world from an early age. Challenging, it is not simply a matter of presenting arguments. It requires a shift in how one sees everything. This is why his philosophy often feels difficult to accept, even when its logic is followed. It does not just propose a new idea. It asks for a different way of experiencing reality, one that goes against deeply ingrained assumptions. He did not expect this shift to happen easily. In many ways, his work can be seen as an attempt to gradually lead the reader toward it, to show step by step that what seems obvious may not be as certain as it appears. By this stage, his system had reached a level of completeness that made it both compelling and unsettling. It offered a clear and consistent alternative to the materialist view of the world, one that removes the need for unseen substances and grounds reality entirely in perception and mind. It also leaves behind a kind of philosophical tension. If reality exists only in perception, and if that perception depends on a universal mind, then the ultimate nature of reality becomes something that cannot be directly experienced in full. Individual perception is always partial, always limited. This means that even within his system, there remains a boundary, not between the individual and an external material world, but between the individual and the full scope of perception itself. The world as experienced is real, but it is not complete. This awareness adds a final layer to his philosophy. It suggests that reality, while accessible, is never fully grasped in its entirety. There is always something beyond individual perception, not as matter, but as a broader field of awareness that sustains everything. And in that sense, his philosophy does not close the question of reality. It transforms it. It shifts the focus away from what exists independently and toward how existence itself is experienced, leaving behind a perspective that is both precise in its reasoning and deeply challenging in its implications. As his life moved toward its later stages, what became increasingly clear was that his philosophy was not simply an abstract challenge to materialism, but a complete reorientation of how reality itself could be understood. By this point, he was no longer refining small details or defending isolated arguments. His system had reached a level of clarity where its implications extended into almost every aspect of thought, from science and religion to everyday experience. He had already removed the idea of matter as something independent, replacing it with a world grounded entirely in perception. But now, the deeper consequence of this view began to settle in. If reality exists only as it is perceived, then the stability, order, and continuity of the world must come from something that is not visible in ordinary experience. This is where his philosophy, which had begun with a focus on perception, fully merges with his understanding of a universal mind. For him, this was not an addition made to save the theory. It was a necessary conclusion. The consistency of the world, the fact that different individuals experience the same structures, the same patterns, the same predictable sequences, all of this requires a foundation that goes beyond individual perception. Without it, reality would fragment into isolated experiences with no shared structure. This idea gives his philosophy a kind of unity. Individual minds perceive, but they do so within a larger system that maintains coherence. The world is not chaotic or unstable because it is continuously perceived in a consistent way at a higher level. This allows him to preserve everything that seems reliable about reality, its order, its predictability, its shared nature, without returning to the concept of material substance. At the same time, this creates a shift in how existence itself is understood. Instead of being a collection of physical objects interacting in space, reality becomes something closer to a continuous field of perception. What we call objects are patterns within that field, stable clusters of experience that appear consistent over time. This perspective changes how one thinks about permanence. In the ordinary view, objects are permanent because they exist independently of observation. In his view, they are permanent because the patterns of perception remain stable. The sense of continuity comes not from an underlying substance, but from the consistency of experience itself. As his work became more widely known, it was met with both fascination and resistance. Some saw it as a brilliant simplification, a way of removing unnecessary assumptions and grounding knowledge in what can actually be experienced. Others saw it as deeply counterintuitive, even absurd, because it seemed to deny the obvious existence of the physical world. This tension reflects something important about his philosophy. It does not fail because it lacks logic. It challenges because it conflicts with deeply ingrained habits of thought. People are accustomed to thinking of reality as something external and independent, and his work asks them to reconsider that assumption at its root. Yet despite the resistance, his ideas continued to influence philosophical discussions, particularly in the development of idealism and later debates about perception and reality. Even those who rejected his conclusions were forced to engage with his arguments, to clarify their own positions in response. In his later years, his life took a more outward turn as he became involved in religious and social roles, eventually serving as a bishop. This aspect of his life is not separate from his philosophy, but an extension of it. His belief in a universal perceiving mind was not just a theoretical position. It was tied to a broader understanding of existence that included moral and spiritual dimensions. For him, the structure of reality was not neutral. It reflected an underlying order that could be associated with purpose and meaning. The world, as perceived, was not random. It followed patterns that could be understood not only scientifically, but also in relation to a larger framework of understanding. At the same time, there is no indication that he moved away from the core of his philosophy. He did not return to materialism or attempt to soften his conclusions. If anything, his later life shows a continued commitment to the idea that reality must be understood through perception rather than through assumptions about unseen substances. As his life came to an end in 1753, what he left behind was not just a set of arguments, but a perspective that continues to unsettle and provoke thought. His philosophy does not offer comfort in the usual sense. It removes a layer of certainty that many people rely on, the idea that the world exists in a fixed, independent way, regardless of perception. But in doing so, it also offers something else, a form of clarity. It forces attention back to experience itself, to what is actually known rather than what is assumed. It challenges the habit of adding invisible explanations where they are not needed. In the end, his work stands as one of the most radical attempts to rethink reality from its foundation. It does not deny the world, but it redefines what the world is. Not a collection of independent objects existing behind perception, but a structured, continuous field of experience sustained through perception itself. And that is where its lasting power lies. Not in providing an easy answer, but in creating a shift that, once seen, is difficult to completely reverse. Because after engaging with his ideas, the question does not simply disappear. It remains quietly persistent. If everything we know exists only as it is perceived, then what exactly are we calling reality? George Berkeley begins his philosophy with a bold and unsettling claim, one that immediately challenges the way most people understand reality. He argues that the world we think exists independently, made up of solid objects, physical matter, and external substances, may not exist in the way we assume it does at all. This is not a small adjustment to existing ideas. It is a complete reversal. Most people believe that objects exist outside the mind, whether or not anyone is perceiving them. A tree stands in a forest, a table remains in a room, and a mountain exists regardless of observation. This belief feels natural and unquestionable. But Berkeley asks a simple question that begins to break this certainty. What exactly do we experience when we perceive something? When we look at a tree, we see color, shape, movement. When we touch it, we feel texture and resistance. When we hear the wind through its leaves, we experience sound. All of these are sensations, things that exist within perception. He points out that we never experience the tree as some hidden substance beyond these sensations. We only ever experience the qualities, the appearances, the perceptions themselves. From this observation, he draws a radical conclusion. If everything we know about objects comes through perception, then what reason do we have to believe in a material substance that exists beyond perception? This leads to his famous principle, often summarized as to be is to be perceived. According to Berkeley, the existence of an object is inseparable from being perceived. An object is not something that exists independently and is later observed. Its existence is tied directly to perception itself. At first, this idea seems extreme, even absurd. It appears to suggest that objects disappear when no one is looking at them. But Berkeley carefully develops his argument to avoid this conclusion in a simplistic form. He distinguishes between ideas and perceivers. Ideas are the things we perceive: colors, sounds, shapes, textures. These exist in the mind. But there must also be something that perceives them, which he calls a spirit or mind. A spirit is not itself an idea. It is the active entity that perceives, thinks, and wills. In this way, reality is made up of two kinds of things: ideas, which are perceived, and minds, which perceive. This means that what we call the physical world is actually a collection of ideas perceived by minds. There is no need to assume a separate material substance underlying these ideas. Berkeley believes that the idea of material substance is unnecessary and even confusing. Philosophers had introduced it to explain how objects exist independently. But for Berkeley, it creates more problems than it solves. If material substance cannot be directly experienced, and if everything we do experience is already explained as ideas in the mind, then material substance becomes an empty concept, something assumed but never observed. By removing it, Berkeley simplifies reality. Instead of a world made of both material objects and mental experiences, there's only one kind of content, ideas, and one kind of active entity, minds. However, this raises an immediate question. If objects exist only as perceptions, what happens when no human is perceiving them? Berkeley's answer introduces one of the most important parts of his philosophy. He argues that there is a constant, infinite mind that perceives everything at all times. This mind is God. Because God perceives everything continuously, objects do not disappear when humans stop observing them. They continue to exist as ideas within the divine mind. This ensures stability and consistency in the world. For example, a tree in a forest continues to exist even when no person is present, because it is still being perceived by God. This idea allows Berkeley to maintain the everyday stability of reality while still rejecting material substance. The world does not depend on human perception alone, but on perception in general, which is ultimately grounded in the divine mind. At the same time, Berkeley emphasizes that our own perceptions are not random or chaotic. They follow patterns and regularities. These patterns are what we call the laws of nature. But instead of seeing these laws as properties of matter, he interprets them as consistent ways in which ideas are presented to us. They are the language through which God communicates the structure of the world. This transforms the way nature is understood. Instead of being a mechanical system of material objects interacting, it becomes a system of ordered perceptions, guided by a consistent and rational source. Another important aspect of his philosophy is his critique of abstraction. Many philosophers believe that the mind could form abstract ideas, such as the idea of a triangle that is neither equilateral nor scalene, or the idea of matter without any specific qualities. Berkeley rejects this. He argues that all ideas are particular. When we think of a triangle, we always imagine a specific shape, even if we use it generally. There is no such thing as a completely abstract idea without any specific characteristics. This critique supports his rejection of material substance. The idea of matter as something that exists without being perceived and without any specific qualities is, in his view, an example of a false abstraction. By removing these abstract assumptions, he believes philosophy can return to what is actually experienced. At this stage, Berkeley's philosophy presents a world that is entirely mental in nature, not in the sense that it is imaginary or unreal, but in the sense that its existence is tied to perception. Objects are real, but their reality consists in being perceived. Minds are real because they are the perceivers, and the stability of the world is grounded in a constant, universal perception. This creates a very different picture of reality from the one most people assume. It removes material substance, replaces it with perception, and places mind at the center of existence. And as this foundation is established, his philosophy begins to move deeper, exploring how knowledge, certainty, and everyday experience function within this immaterial world, and how a person can understand reality when everything that exists is either perceiving or being perceived. As Berkeley's philosophy develops further, he begins to strengthen his position by confronting the most immediate doubts that arise from his view. If reality is made up entirely of ideas and minds, And if objects exist only as they are perceived, then how can we trust the world at all? How can anything be stable, reliable, or shared between different people? These are not small concerns, and Berkeley takes them seriously. Instead of avoiding them, he builds his philosophy directly around them. He begins by examining the difference between imagination and perception. At first, both seem similar. When a person imagines something, they're experiencing ideas in the mind. When they perceive something, they're also experiencing ideas in the mind. So what makes them different? Berkeley argues that the difference lies in their order, consistency, and force. Ideas that come through perception, such as seeing a tree or feeling the warmth of sunlight, are vivid, structured, and follow consistent patterns. They do not appear randomly. They are stable, repeatable, and shared across different observers. In contrast, ideas that come from imagination are weaker, less stable, and under our control. A person can imagine something and then change it or dismiss it at will. These ideas do not have the same consistency or independence. This distinction is important because it shows that not all ideas are equal. The world we experience through perception has a kind of order that imagination does not. This order is what gives the world its sense of reality. Berkeley explains this order not by referring to material objects, but by pointing to the consistent activity of the divine mind. The regularity of perception is not caused by matter, but by the stable way in which ideas are presented to us. This means that what we call the laws of nature are not properties of physical objects, but patterns in how we experience ideas. These patterns are reliable because they are grounded in a consistent source. This allows Berkeley to preserve the predictability of the world without relying on material substance. When we expect the sun to rise or a stone to fall, we are not relying on hidden physical forces. We are relying on the regular patterns of perception that have been consistently presented to us. From here, he turns to the question of knowledge. If everything we know comes through perception, then knowledge itself must be based on ideas. But does this make knowledge uncertain or limited? Berkeley argues the opposite. He believes his system actually strengthens certainty rather than weakening it. In traditional philosophy, knowledge often depends on the assumption that our perceptions correspond to an external material world. But this creates a gap. How can we be sure that what we perceive matches what actually exists? Berkeley removes this gap entirely. Since objects are nothing more than collections of ideas, and since ideas are directly perceived, there is no separation between appearance and reality. To perceive something is to know it. This creates a more direct form of knowledge. There is no hidden layer of material substance that must be inferred. What we experience is what exists. At the same time, he acknowledges that there are limits. We do not perceive everything, and our perceptions can change. But within what is perceived, knowledge is immediate and certain. He then explores how different people can experience the same world. If reality consists of ideas and minds, how do multiple individuals share a common experience? Berkeley's answer again returns to the role of a universal perceiver. The consistency of experience across different individuals is not accidental. It is maintained through a single, overarching order. When two people look at the same object, they do not share a material thing. Instead, they each receive a set of ideas that are coordinated in a consistent way. This coordination creates the appearance of a shared external world. In this sense, reality is not divided between separate individuals. It is unified through a common structure of perception. Another important issue he addresses is causation. In traditional thinking, physical objects are believed to cause changes in other objects. A ball strikes another ball, and it moves. Fire heats metal, and it becomes hot. But Berkeley questions this idea. Since material substance does not exist, physical objects cannot be the true causes of anything. They are only collections of ideas. So where does causation come from? He argues that true causation can only belong to minds, because only minds have the power to act. Ideas themselves are passive. They do not cause other ideas. They simply appear in a certain order. This means that what we call cause and effect in the physical world is actually a pattern in how ideas are presented. When we see one event followed by another consistently, we assume a causal relationship. But in reality, both events are part of an ordered sequence. The true cause behind this sequence is the active mind that presents these ideas in a consistent way. This shifts the understanding of the world from a system of interacting objects to a system of meaningful patterns. Events are not driven by mechanical forces, but by a structured order of perception. Berkeley also uses this idea to argue against skepticism. Many philosophers had worried that we might be trapped in our own perceptions, unable to know anything beyond them. But Berkeley turns this concern around. He argues that there is nothing beyond perception that needs to be known. Since reality consists of ideas and minds, and since we directly experience ideas, there is no hidden world to doubt. This eliminates the traditional problem of skepticism. Instead of questioning whether perceptions match reality, we recognize that perceptions are reality. However, this does not lead to isolation. Because the structure of perception is shared and consistent, individuals are not trapped in separate worlds. They participate in a common, ordered experience. At this stage, Berkeley's philosophy becomes more stable and complete. He has addressed concerns about reality, knowledge, shared experience, and causation, all within a system that does not rely on material substance. What emerges is a world that is entirely dependent on perception, yet still ordered, reliable, and meaningful. A world where objects exist as ideas, where minds are the active agents, and where consistency is grounded in a deeper unity. And as this structure becomes clearer, his philosophy moves into its next stage, where it begins to explore the deeper implications of this immaterial world, especially how it shapes our understanding of existence, the role of the divine, and what it ultimately means to say that reality is not made of matter, but of perception itself. As Berkeley's philosophy continues to deepen, he begins to draw out the full implications of a world built entirely on perception and mind. By this stage, the basic structure is already in place. There are no material substances, only ideas that are perceived and minds that perceive them. But what does this actually mean for how we understand reality at its deepest level? He now turns to a more subtle question. If everything we experience is an idea, then what does it mean for something to truly exist? Earlier, he defined existence in terms of being perceived, but now he expands this idea to show how it reshapes our entire understanding of the world. In traditional thinking, existence is often imagined as something solid and independent, something that remains the same regardless of observation. But in Berkeley's system, existence is not a hidden property beneath appearances. It is directly tied to experience itself. An object does not have a second, deeper layer beyond what is perceived. Its color, shape, texture, and other qualities are not just signs of something else. They're the thing itself. There's no need to go beyond them to find a more real version of the object. This removes a distinction that had dominated philosophy for a long time, the distinction between appearance and reality. For Berkeley, this distinction collapses. What appears is what exists as long as it is perceived. This does not make the world shallow or illusory. Instead, it makes it immediate. Reality is not hidden behind perception. It is given directly through it. From here, he begins to explore the nature of ideas in greater detail. Ideas, as he describes them, are passive. They do not act, change themselves, or cause other ideas. They simply exist as they are perceived. This raises an important question. If ideas are passive, then where does activity come from? Where does change, motion, or transformation originate? Berkeley's answer is consistent with his earlier view. Activity belongs only to minds. A mind perceives, thinks, and wills. It is not something that is observed like an idea. It is something that does the observing. This creates a clear division within reality. On one side, there are ideas which are experienced. On the other side, there are minds which experience. This distinction becomes central. It means that all movement, all change, and all order in the world must ultimately come from the activity of mind rather than from any property of objects themselves. He then returns to the patterns we observe in nature. Earlier, he explained these patterns as consistent sequences of ideas. Now he deepens this explanation by showing how these patterns form what we call the structure of the world. For example, when we see fire followed by heat, or movement followed by impact, we begin to form expectations. These expectations become so familiar that we treat them as natural laws. But for Berkeley, these are not laws built into matter. They are habits of perception, regularities in how ideas are presented to us. They are reliable, but they are not caused by physical substances. This leads to a different understanding of science. Instead of discovering the hidden mechanisms of matter, science becomes the study of patterns in experience. It observes how ideas are consistently arranged and uses those patterns to make predictions. In this way, science remains valid and useful, even without material substance. It still describes the regularities of the world, but it does so without assuming that those regularities come from physical objects acting on each other. Berkeley believes this actually simplifies science. It removes the need to speculate about invisible substances and focuses only on what can be experienced and observed. At the same time, he addresses a deeper concern. If reality depends on perception, does this make it fragile or dependent on individual minds? His answer, once again, points to the role of a universal perceiver. The consistency of the world does not depend on any one human mind. It is grounded in a constant and infinite perception that does not change or fail. Because of this, the world remains stable even when individual observers come and go. The ideas that make up reality continue to exist within this constant perception. This idea also gives a deeper meaning to the order of the world. It is not random or accidental. It reflects a consistent structure that is maintained across all experience. Berkeley then considers how this view affects human understanding. If everything that exists is either a mind or an idea, then knowledge becomes more direct but also more limited. We can know ideas because we perceive them. We can know that we are minds because we experience our own thinking and willing. But we do not perceive other minds directly. We infer their existence from patterns in our experience. For example, when we see other people acting, speaking, and responding in ways similar to ourselves, we infer that they are also minds. This inference is not based on direct perception, but on analogy and consistency. This introduces a subtle distinction. While ideas are directly known, other minds are known indirectly. This does not make them uncertain, but it shows that knowledge operates in different ways depending on what is being known. He also reflects on language and how it shapes understanding. Words often suggest the existence of things that go beyond experience. Terms like matter, substance, or external reality can create the impression of something hidden behind perception. Berkeley argues that careful thinking requires attention to how language is used. Many philosophical problems arise not from reality itself, but from confusion in how words are applied. By focusing on what is actually experienced and avoiding unnecessary abstractions, these problems can be reduced or eliminated. As this stage of his philosophy develops, the picture becomes clearer and more complete. Reality is immediate, not hidden. Ideas are passive, minds are active. Patterns in perception create the structure of the world. Knowledge is direct in some cases and inferred in others. What emerges is a system that removes the traditional division between mind and matter and replaces it with a simpler structure based entirely on perception and activity. And as this understanding settles in, the final stage of Berkeley's philosophy begins to gather all of these ideas together, asking what it ultimately means to live in a world where existence is inseparable from perception, where reality is not material but experiential, and where mind stands at the center of everything that is. As Berkeley's philosophy reaches its final stage, all of his ideas begin to settle into a single, coherent vision of reality, one that is radically different from the common view, yet internally consistent and carefully constructed. What began as a simple question about perception now becomes a complete way of understanding existence, knowledge, and the structure of the world. At this point, the central claim stands fully formed. Reality does not consist of material substance existing independently of perception. Instead, it consists entirely of minds and ideas. Ideas are what we perceive, and minds are what perceive. Nothing else is required to explain the world. This conclusion removes a layer that had long been assumed necessary. The idea of matter, as something existing behind or beneath appearances, is no longer needed. Everything that is experienced already exists as it appears, without requiring a hidden support. From this, Berkeley draws an important consequence. The world is not divided between appearance and reality. There is no gap between what we perceive and what exists. To perceive something is for it to exist, and its existence consists precisely in that perception. This creates a more immediate and direct understanding of life. There is no need to doubt whether the world we experience is real, because there is nothing beyond it that needs to be compared. The colors, sounds, shapes, and textures that fill experience are not signs of something else. They're the substance of reality itself. At the same time, this does not lead to isolation or subjectivity in the way one might expect. The world remains stable, ordered, and shared. This is because perception is not limited to individual human minds. It is grounded in a constant and universal perception that maintains the continuity of all things. This universal perception ensures that the world does not disappear when it is not being observed by any one person. It also ensures that different individuals experience a consistent and coordinated reality. What appears as a shared external world is, in Berkeley's view, a shared system of ideas presented in a consistent way. He then brings together his earlier discussion of causation in a final form. Since ideas are passive and cannot cause anything, and since material substance does not exist, causation must be understood differently. What we call cause and effect is not a direct interaction between objects. It is a regular sequence of ideas. When one event consistently follows another, we form the habit of expecting that sequence. This expectation becomes what we call a law of nature. But the true source of this order is not within the objects themselves. It lies in the active principle that organizes these sequences. The world is not a machine driven by matter, but a structured flow of perceptions guided by a consistent and intelligible order. This leads to a different understanding of science and knowledge. Science does not uncover hidden material forces. It describes the patterns within experience. It identifies regularities and uses them to predict future perceptions. In this sense, science remains reliable and meaningful, but its foundation shifts. It no longer depends on unseen substances, but on observable consistency. Berkeley also brings clarity to the role of the human mind within this system. A person is not a passive observer of a material world. They are an active perceiver within a larger field of perception. Their experience is real, immediate, and meaningful, but it is also part of a greater structure that extends beyond individual awareness. This creates a balance between individuality and unity. Each mind has its own perspective, but all perspectives are connected through a shared order. He then reflects on the limits of human knowledge. While ideas are directly perceived and therefore known with certainty, the full structure of reality is not entirely accessible. The underlying order that produces the consistency of experience is not something we perceive directly. This introduces a sense of humility. Human understanding is real and reliable within experience, but does not extend beyond it into hidden realms. There is no need to speculate about what cannot be experienced. At the same time, this limitation is not seen as a weakness. It is simply a recognition of the boundaries of knowledge. By staying within what can be experienced and understood, philosophy avoids unnecessary confusion. Berkeley also emphasizes the importance of clarity in thinking. Many philosophical problems arise from the misuse of language, from assuming the existence of things that are not actually experienced. Words can create the illusion of complexity where none exists. By carefully examining what is meant by each concept and grounding it in experience, these problems can be dissolved rather than solved. As everything comes together, Berkeley's philosophy presents a world that is simpler in structure but richer in immediacy. There are no hidden substances, no inaccessible layers, and no gap between perception and reality. Everything that exists is either perceiving or being perceived. This leads to a final understanding of existence that is both radical and direct. To exist is not to stand behind appearances, but to be present within them. Reality is not something distant or concealed. It is what is given an experience, moment by moment. In this way, Berkeley offers a vision of life that removes unnecessary abstraction and brings attention back to what is immediately known. A world where perception is not a barrier to reality, but the very condition of it, and where the mind stands at the center of everything that can be said to exist.